Today is the 27th of April, 2004. We are at the Warhawk Air Museum in Napa, Idaho. Today, we are fortunate enough to interview F. Willard Robinson, also known as Robbie Robinson, as part of the Veterans History Project in partnership with the Library of Congress. My name is Tim Peterson. I will be conducting the interview. Also present in the room is Jan Peterson, the director and camera operator. Mr. Robinson, welcome, and please give us your full name, your date of birth, and your address.
Well, my full name is Franklin Willard Robinson Jr., but I never wanted to go by Jr. particularly. They didn't want to get mixed up, so I've always been known as F. Willard Robinson. And in the Navy, they gave me the moniker Robbie, and that has lasted over the years, so people now usually refer to me as Robbie Robinson.
Very good. We will do that. And your address?
My address is 796 River Park Lane in Boise, Idaho.
Very good. And your date of birth?
My date of birth is September 11th, 1918.
Very good. Thank you. Robbie, can you tell us where you were born?
I was born in Long Beach, California.
And did you grow up in Long Beach?
I grew up in Long Beach, but the first few years of my life, it's interesting. We built a home on Signal Hill before the richest oil field in the world, really, per acre. And I lived there. We just moved in, and shell number 1 came in. It blew up as a geyser and then caught fire. And my earliest memory is that oil over our house, and of course we tore that down. And my dad then put about 8 oil wells on that section of land there, and it drilled more oil than any other well on Signal Hill. So I have a lot of memories about Long Beach, but we had a ranch about 4 hours, in those days, 4 hours away, cattle ranch, and so I'd spend my summers and lived there until, didn't start school, I was 7 years old, but came back to Long Beach to go to elementary and junior high, and graduated from Long Beach Polytechnic High School. So I was Southern California.
And the cattle ranch was located in?
Well, it was located in the northwest corner of Los Angeles County. And we ran on the National Forest, and then we bordered, our front door was the Tejon Ranch, which is the largest ranch in California, 55 miles into Bakersfield from where we lived on the backside of Mount Avery.
And about how old were you when this explosion occurred on Signal Hill?
That was 1922, so I was about 3.5 years old. But I remember.
And you remember that?
Oh, yes,
yeah.
I do. It rocked the house when that thing erupted.
And where did you go to high school?
Long Beach Polytechnic High School. And my father had graduated there in 1905.
Really? So your dad came from?
Well, his father was an evangelist, Methodist evangelist, established churches in California, and was a circuit rider. And in fact, that's where he met my mother, was because his father, they'd homesteaded in Parkfield, California, and he was riding through, and they put the preacher up while he would preach. And he says, there's a little girl up there you want to meet. Well, he was in law school back at Colorado at the time. He'd gone to USC, but he'd gone on a debate scholarship and won a national competitive oratorical contest, and so stayed to finish up a law degree at Columbia University. So when he came back, he wasn't particularly interested in going out to Parkfield, California to meet a little girl out there, but they kept insisting that he meet her, and that's where he met my mother.
Now, how many brothers and sisters do you have?
I was the oldest of 4. My brother was Charles W. Robinson. He was a year younger than I was, and he graduated in economics at Berkeley. Then the war came along. He was always interested in ships, so he went back to Annapolis and was asked to stay there to teach steam engineering. but he wanted to get into the war, so he eventually released him to go on the Tuscaloosa, which was the heavy cruiser, and he was on the Murmas runs for a number of years on that run, and then they were sending to knock out the German batteries at Utah Beach on D-Day, and it's the only heavy cruiser that was not sunk in World War II, and they never took a shot. They never took a hit, even though there were 240 rounds fired at them by the Germans at Utah Beach. Mm-hmm. It's a really interesting story about how they escaped that. Then it was under the kamikaze attacks in Okinawa at the end of the war. Then later became the largest iron ore producer in South America, and developed the largest iron ore carriers in Japan, and put the largest ship that's ever gone through the Panama Canal. But it was quite a shipping company to take this iron ore back. Well, then later they asked him to come back under the Ford administration, and he was Deputy Secretary of State under Kissinger during the Ford and the Bush administration.
Uh-huh. And what was your brother's name?
Charles W. Robinson.
Charles W.
And
Robinson.
then my younger brother is Ted Robinson, who is one of the foremost golf course designers in the United States. He did Sahalee, where the PGA tournament was done over in Washington, and he's designed over 350 courses throughout the world. And then my sister is married to John Jaquo in Eugene, Oregon, and he, along with Bowerman and Knight, founded Nike Corporation, and they have a beautiful ranch over there in. And his story, incidentally, is I tell his story. His family didn't know it, but he was with Marine Squadron 232 during the Solomon Islands campaign, and that Marine Squadron lost more flyers than any other Marine squadron in the history of naval aviation. Actually, on one of his last runs back from Rabaul, he saw Boynton shot down, and he didn't. And that's kind of interesting. I tell that story. He's still living in Eugene, Oregon, and it's well known in that area over there. And then my sister continued her education and got her doctorate in psychology at the University of Oregon, and was the first union analyst in the Pacific Northwest. So she led an interesting life on her own.
Mm-hmm. Now, did you complete college before?
I had graduated. I went to the University of Southern California on a national competitive scholarship, full scholarship to SC. They awarded 2 of them in the United States, and I was fortunate enough to get 1 of them. But at the end of 2 years, I just wanted to have more of an experience, and I getting to sit in the classroom every day, to tell you the truth. So another fellow and I decided to take a little sailboat and sail to Alaska. And we went up there in 1939. Actually, the year before, I'd kind of had adventures because of, I'd introduced the Raleigh 3-speed bike. It was the first geared bike, 3-speed bike. And I was given a bike right in the to ride it across country from Detroit to Los Angeles. And so I did that. In those days, it's quite a feat, because I did that in 14 days and 3 hours. And,
oh, good golly.
Yeah, and so that was publicized widely. And the next year, in the summer, we took that bike out to Utah and went into the backcountry, which is now the Escalante National Monument area. But people had never been in there. There were no roads in there. We didn't see another person for 30 days, and had an amazing adventure and experience back in there. Ran out of food, but we were able to had a little 22 and killed a deer and dried it, and we got enough to get out. So we were kind of did some foolish things in a way, but very, very interesting things. And then the following year, we decided to go to Alaska, and so when we got there, because we didn't know too much about sailing, but we did get there. But
so as you grew up, you didn't learn how to sail as a youngster?
Well, yes, I had the privilege of my father had gone to school with a fellow by the name of Horn, who had the Contender, which had set the race to Honolulu by sailing over there in 8 days, and then they asked me to be cabin boy on that sloop, the Contender, 110-foot yaw, actually. And so I'd had a little experience and had a little sailboat, but I really didn't know too much about it. Mm-hmm. Not enough to take off on something like that, but we made it.
So you left from.
And then when I got there, well, I realized that we only had $7.50 when we got there, and we'd live off of salmon and fish and berries, but it was too wet and cold. I said that was no way, so I made my way up to Fairbanks, Alaska, and met Judge Bunnell, who was the president of the university. And I said, I had 2 years at SC, and I wanted to finish up there, and but I didn't have any money. And he said, well, there's a little cabin down at the foot of the hill, and you got a sleeping bag, and you can build a fire there. There's a stove in there, and we'll give you a job cleaning the blackboards and sweeping the halls. And that fall was when the Panzer Division started moving to the lowlands. It was 1919, early September 39. And about 2 months later, an Army officer came into flyer, flew into Fairbanks in his bi-wing Waco airplane, and came out to the university and said they wanted to train pilots, the government, and they would take 20 of us. And I thought, well, there's no way I could ever learn to fly on my own because I had no money at all. But I was selected, and so I went into that program and flew and soloed on skis there in January of '40. And well, the 20 wasn't because I was the best flyer, but just the way the flight schedules worked out, I was the first one to finish up the course. And so it became quite an event because Gentry was the FAA inspector, and he flew in from Anchorage and broadcast my solo flight there. And it was the broadcast throughout the territory. But in those days, I soloed on skis. We saw it 57 degrees below zero, and you can imagine flying in that kind of weather. And yet, I got my commercial rating and started doing bush piloting that summer up there. But I was the first government-trained pilot in the territory of Alaska, and there wasn't a single radio range station in the whole territory there. Joe Crossan, who I saw that first airmail plane come into Fairbanks. It had flown from Juneau and flown by Joe Crossan. It was the Electra that came in, and he was the one that flew Will Rogers' body out when Will Rogers and Wiley Post were killed up there. So I knew all those fellows that were early Gilliam and those fellows that were first bush pilots in Alaska before World War II.
And what type of airplane did you solo?
Well, I soloed in. Well, actually, in that time, it was what became the J3. Piper took it over, but it was a J3 Cub.
Mm-hmm. And then you stayed and flew the summer.
Well, then I stayed, and then that summer I got it because I still needed money, and I got a job driving the dump truck to build the Ladd Field military base, which they built as a staging base, because you see, those days Russia was an ally, not an enemy at that time, and they were ferrying the planes over to Russia, and they come over, and Ladd Field was the staging, and so we put in those runways there. At the end of summer, well, I realized I wanted to finish. Oh, at that time, after I finished up, I volunteered to to go into the Eagle Squadron, because we were quite taken by all that was going on over there. And so I volunteered to go into the Eagle Squadron, and they sent me back a notice that the billets were closed for right then. They were keeping me on a waiting list.
Tell us about the Eagle Squadron.
Well, the Eagle Squadron was a group of Americans that went over to fly with the British during the air campaign, when the Germans thought they could take. The Germans thought they could take. They'd taken the lowlands after Dunkirk, and they thought they could take over England in an air battle that'd last about a week. But they didn't figure that even though the British lost a lot, they could bail out and be flying the next day, and they held on during that campaign, and it failed, which was really surprised the Germans. But during that time, we were quite taken with what was going on, so a number of Americans wanted to go over and fly with the British and be trained. But that, I realized then, while I was waiting and I had been accepted, I went back to USC and finished up my, see, I'd had 2 years at SC, and then I had a year. In fact, I took 44 credits, so I had a lot of credits that I take at the University of Alaska that year. And then when I came back, I finished up my final year at the University of Southern California. I never did get to graduate because Pearl Harbor came on the 7th, and I was to graduate in February. And I went down and enlisted on the 8th. I realized then there's no point in going to England, so I enlisted in the Navy on the day after Pearl Harbor. And then went back and finished up my work and was called, I passed my physical, but they couldn't take me in until 2 weeks before I was to graduate, so I didn't have to take my finals. They let me, gave me my degree. I never got to go to graduation because by that time I was in Texas. I went through elimination training at Long Beach Naval Air Station, and then that's where they kind of washed you out. I never did tell them. I had my commercial ratings, but I never told them that, because they'd always take you down because they wanted to fly the Navy way. So I was smart enough to never tell them what's a stick, what's a rudder, And so I got through pretty well, and got off to a good start, and then went down to Corpus Christi then for my primary training.
Mm-hmm. And what type of airplanes were you flying in Long Beach?
Well, in Long Beach was the old N2N. It was manufactured by the Navy. In fact, you have one on display here, and that I soloed in that one.
By wing. And then you went to Texas.
And I went to Texas in the primary training, and then the primary trainer down there was the Stearman, the S2N, the N2N.
N2N.
Okay. And then went through primary training there, and then went into basic training at Corpus. They had a number of fields there off the main base, but and I flew the OS2U, which is kind of the old observation plane, and then we got training in the NV Vultee.
Then after flying the N2N in Long Beach, you then went to Texas and you flew...
I flew the Stearman, the N3N Stearmans, biplane open cockpit, and that's where we had our primary training there. And then from there we were sent out to Cabanas, although we still lived on the main base. And we flew the OS2U that was the next step up. And also at that base, our first training in the SNV, which is the Vultee. We needed to get training in that plane. It still was fixed landing gear. I still hadn't, all of them were fixed landing gears up until that time. But we were trained in that one so we could take our instrument training in SNV. And then it was interesting because when we got back to the main base, up until that time, they never trained torpedo pilots. They always trained. They trained the dive bomber pilots had special training, and the fighter pilots had a special training, and then they would take certain pilots that had been trained either as fighters or dive bombers and put them into torpedo bombers for operational training later on. But that was in June of 42. And it was right after the Battle of Midway. And you remember what happened to the Battle of Midway? They lost all of their torpedo planes. In fact, I had a story that because I flew the only fellow that made it back out of 24 planes at the Battle of Midway in 12 minutes off the Hornet. There was only one still flying. And one was picked up, was a gay, because he went down, and he was flying the old TBDs. Incidentally, I flew the TBDs later, but just in training in Florida. But they shot every one of those down, and there were 6 Avengers that were detached from Torpedo 8 because they were the first that came to the fleet, this torpedo bomber. And they arrived in Hawaii, and the Hornet had to leave early because they got word that the Japanese fleet was coming in to Midway. The code was broken. So they put belly tanks on these 6 Avengers and flew them to Midway, take out the belly tanks that night and rigged them up and loaded them with torpedoes. And there were 6 of those. And one of them was Bert Ernest, and they took off on the Battle of Midway, but in 12 minutes, all of the Devastators had been shot down, and 5 of the Avengers had been shot down, and Bert Ernest got back, and his gunner was killed. He was hit in the neck, and his radioman had been knocked out, but he got back to Midway. His compass had been shot out, and he had no elevator control as he was going toward the water. He just almost instinctively pulled that tab back, and that pulled it up, and he flew it back to Midway, just flying with the tab. And with one wheel down, he landed, and I've got a picture in this book that's I just got it from Bert Ernest that shows that plane. It had 147 bullet holes in it, and they couldn't imagine how that thing kept flying, but he got back.
Wow, unbelievable.
So anyway, my point is only this, that all of a sudden they needed torpedo pilots. And so there were 3,000 cadets at Corpus at the time, and they called us to the main hangar, and they told us what had happened. And they said they wanted volunteers to be torpedo pilots, and so 30 of us volunteered.
Tell us the difference between a torpedo pilot and a dive pilot.
A dive bomber pilot dives straight down, and they have dive flaps. Those are the OSBDs, Dauntless Dive Bombers. And they'll dive right straight down. Now, we did dive bombing with the Avengers, but we had no flaps. So that our dive was not straight down, but it was at about a 60-degree angle. And we did dive bombing with the Avengers later on.
Is that why the torpedo pilots had such a terrible...
No, the torpedo pilot, that was why it was so dangerous, because a torpedo pilot was trained to come in low. Now you would dive down, but when you pulled out, when that torpedo had to be released, it had to be released at 200 knots and your speed reduced to 200 miles an hour. And you couldn't be slipping or sliding or anything, because that had to be a firm foundation to launch that torpedo, or they broach on you. So that's when all the fire would be coming. And I have a story in here. The other fellow that I flew with got the initial hit on the Musashi, which is the largest battleship in the world, along with the Yamato. And he got the first torpedo hit, and that was the Battle of Leyte Gulf. And how he got in and out is amazing. because he was the lone plane that came in, and it tells how that happened. But they later put 13 more torpedoes and about 40 bombs and rolled it over. But it's an amazing story of how, you know, how he got in and got out. Now, I didn't have to make any torpedo runs. They did a lot of torpedo dummy work, but fortunately by that time, we went out with rockets and bombing. We were doing a lot more of the bombing. But Bert Ernest made 6 torpedo runs, more torpedo runs than any other person in history of military aviation, and he's still alive. I talked to him about it. The other fellow that was picked up was Ensign Gay, but he died of a heart attack about 8 years ago. And his ashes were taken out and spread at Midway to be with his buddies.
Oh boy!
But you know, the thing is that they were still credited with the victory over the Japanese, because what happened is that in the attacks, the fighters are supposed to go down first and strafe, and then the dive bombers come in, and then to knock it off and finish it off, by that time the torpedo planes come in. Well, they got all mixed up at the Battle of Midway, and the torpedo planes got there first, and the Zeros were waiting for them up above, and they came down and got them all, and then ran out of gas and got back on the carriers, and then the fighters never did get there, but the dive bombers came in unopposed. Not only got the carriers, they sunk 3 carriers the first day, and one the next day they sunk 4 of the carriers and knocked out most of their planes because they got them on the deck. So if it hadn't been for the torpedo bombers, we'd have never won the Battle of Midway. Amazing story.
And which carrier were you on?
I was on the Manila Bay. I've flown off a number of them, but I was on the Manila Bay.
In Midway?
No, I wasn't at Midway. See, that was at Midway when we heard this. That's why they came back and said we want to train torpedo pilots, because we need torpedo pilots.
Okay, so you were still in Texas.
I was just finished my intermediate training, or basic training, and was going into advanced training to get my wings. And so I went into the first Torpedo 13, and was stationed at the main base in Corpus Christi. And I flew in that in the summer and trained in the summer of 43.
43. Okay.
No, summer of 42. I'm ahead of myself. This is summer 42.
Okay. And then once you completed your advanced training,
then my advanced training, we got our wings. And it was an amazing thing, because it was during the gas rationing, but my dad had ways of dealing with things. I don't know, but he had a Lincoln Zephyr, and he drove my mother out from Long Beach, California, and she pinned my gold wings on at Corpus Christi. That was kind of a neat thing. And then they went back to California, and then I got on the train and went to Opelika, Florida for my operational training. And there were a few TBDs from the other carriers that were still around, and we took our torpedo training in the old Douglas Devastators out of Opelika, Florida, near Miami.
So this is where you started your training on how to land
on the carriers. We did that in the SNJs. We did night work too there, and then I trained right after Christmas. In fact, Christmas Eve, I was in. I met my brother because I was going to qualify out of Norfolk, Virginia, and I went to Academy and met him, and he took me down to the bus, because I took the train to Washington, D.C., and then the bus down to Norfolk. And that's to qualify do my carrier qualifications out of Norfolk. And that was colder than I ever was in Alaska. I tell you, that humidity, it was horrible. And all of our flight gear, we were still in that flight gear, and I thought we were going to freeze to death up there, because you had to open the canopies, and we waited for a week to weather to clear because we were to qualify in the Atlantic on an English carrier, the HMS Attacker. And that was a very, very low day, and because 12 of us went out, and 3 of them were killed that day qualifying. I didn't know any of the others except one was Bob Kuntz, who I trained with, and he was a boy from Nebraska who'd been married just 29 days before. And on the approach to the carrier, he was ahead of me, and the plane stalled and went in, and I landed, and the guy told me to cut off my engine, and we went around and never did find him. And in that English accent, he says, he got up on the wing, he says, "Blimey, keep up your airspeed." He says, "We've lost 3 already. That's the 3rd one today." Well, the other 2, what had happened was that they didn't build up enough pressure in the catapult and shot them just off. They went in the water and the carrier went over them. So they lost those 2. And I tell you, and I still had 3 more to shoot. And I tell you, that was the worst day of my life. It was so cold. And I don't know what I was shaking because of the cold, or because I was scared. I don't know. But and then I got back flew my plane back to Norfolk Air Base, and the chaplain there met me, asked me if I knew Bob Kuntz, and I said, yeah, I did. And well, he says, there's been too many of these. He said, would you go with me? Because his wife was living in you couldn't get a place to live, but they were living in a boarding house there in Norfolk. So I had to go over and tell her that Bob was killed that morning, and it was a very hard time. And then he said, well, will you take her back to Nebraska? And I said, yeah, I could, because I had orders. I qualified and made my 8 landings. And so I took her back and met her, and her parents met her in Nebraska. And I came on to California and to go into then I was assigned to Navy Operational Squadron.
And where were you assigned?
Well, I went to North Island. That's where I got my orders, and I was assigned.
North Island is in San Diego?
That's San Diego,
yeah.
North Island Naval Air Base. And was assigned to a composite squadron that was going to be commissioned, a brand new squadron in Sandpoint. And that was interesting because I had gone periodically with a very wonderful girl during high school. She was much younger than I was. But I went up and found her working in a bank on the way, and asked her if she would get married. And they didn't have any money in those days, and I said, I know it's quick. She says, well, how could I do that? I haven't seen you for 2 years. I said, I know, but I'm going to call you in 3 days. Well, that's her story. Most women pick up that chapter and read it first, because that took a pretty brave thing. That she came up on the train. It's hard to even get there, and we were married at Sandpoint, the first ones in the squadron to be married.
And your wife's name?
Joan L. Robinson. And it's, now we've been married 61 years. And we didn't know if we'd have 30 days together then. That's kind of neat.
61 years. Mm-hmm. So you think it's going to work?
Well, it's one of those impetuous war marriages. It still might work out, she says. No, we get along pretty darn well. So it's kind of an amazing story because, no, she was the only one. The squadron came. We had a beautiful wedding at the Methodist Church, University Methodist Church there at the University of Washington. But she was the only woman there. But she was thrilled because they were all in their wings and gold braid and wings. But we thought we were going to go right out after 30 days. But we were pulled out to be the first squadron to ever be trained in night attack work. And of course we were kind of disappointed in some ways at the time because they were anxious to get out, but things were going so bad in the early days out in on the Solomon Islands that our fire group, who was trained to fly cover for us, were pulled out to be trained in the Hellcat and went out with the first Hellcat squadron to take over because the Wildcats were no match for the Zeros.
Mm-hmm.
And so they left. And we were lucky to get pulled out because the other squadron that was working with us at Composite Squadron, either one of us could have been selected for this, but they took that Composite Squadron and sent them out on the Liscum Bay for the Tarawa invasion. Well, the night that they were to go in, they got hit by a torpedo, and every member of that squadron was killed. There were 450 were killed when that Liscum Bay blew up, and that whole squadron wiped out the whole squadron. And tells a story of this in this book. But we were sent down because our fighters then went out in new Hellcats to go into the Solomon Island campaign, and we were pulled out to do night attack work and sent out to Holtville, California, near Yuma, to do this work on Salton Sea, and flew, made night torpedo attacks, all those kinds of things, night bombing, and then during that time, why the skipper called us in, and he said the Navy wants us to do a very special thing. They're coming out with a new weapon system of rockets, and so they want our squadron to work on this. And so I was flying wing on the skipper, and the skipper took me and another fellow out to a very secret place called Goldstone Lake, where we met these first Rocketeers that were developing. And we didn't do any firing that day. We just landed on the dry lake bed out there. And they told us what they were doing, and so we took it back, and our planes were put rails under them to launch these rockets. And then he came to me one morning, I said it was late fall, 43. Actually, the day was December 3rd, 1943. He came in, he says, "Robbie, they're ready to fire these rockets, and I want you to fly to Inyokern." That's a little auxiliary air station at the base of the Sierras. It had been commissioned 30 days before, and the Caltech team will be there, and they're going to fire these first rockets that they've ever tried. So I took off and flew out alone out over Muroc Dry Lake, which is later Edwards Air Force Base, where the space shuttles came in. Of course, there were no space shuttles in those days. Well, because and landed at this little air station. I was the only plane on the field, and the project director was there, and they said, "Well, while they're loading these planes on these rockets on these rails, I want to show you, take you out to the target." So we drove about 7 miles out the direction what's now China Lake, but it wasn't even commissioned then. It wasn't even China Lake then. And there was a couple old telephone poles and some lattice and work up there. And he says, "You think you can hit that?" And I said, "I don't know. I never fired these things before." So we came back, and in the meantime, I thought, the problem with these things is that they lop. And you're supposed, if I could fire them at 1,000 yards and know when that 1,000 yards was there, I might have a better chance after firing the first shot to see what the drop would be in trajectory. So I asked my radio man, I says, "Can you," because we had the first radars ever put in the planes for this, because night work, they were very primitive radars. And I got him to calibrate, but they weren't accurate at all and weren't too effective. So that's when they figured if they could launch them at 200 miles an hour, then they would be more stable. And so that was the same rocket that they used, but they had put explosive heads on them. They're 5-inch rockets, but that gave me the same as a full salvo from a light cruiser, 400 each wings. Well, when we got out to Pearl Harbor, and we're on our way to the Marshall Islands for that. That was the first big attack, counterattack of the war. Because even though Tarawa was before, and that was the main one, but this was a tremendous attack for that time. The Navy brass had never heard of these, so they asked me about 4 days out of Pearl Harbor on our way to Midway, would I go up? And they wanted to see a test firing. We had the admiral, flag admiral on the Manila Bay. There were 5 carriers in our group, and so they put rockets on my plane, and I went up and they put a spar out behind the carrier, and I said, you know, too close. You better let out a little more. No, they came back on the radio. He says, no, the admiral wants a good look. And I came down and let those 4 rounds off, and they exploded around this spar there and blew shrapnel on the carrier. Well, it didn't do any damage, but I'm telling you, the ray came back. That's enough. You know? And I found out later in the book he was duly impressed. But the first they were ever used were the first week of February, 1944, and we were just supporting the landing troops. So you circle up there, and they say, okay, it's all gridded off, the island of Kwajalein and K1, and they say, okay, we want so many bombs and K3, and 3 planes go down. And then we said, what do we do with the Cordellas? Now the reason he said Cordellas is everything that you had, you didn't want the enemy to know what you had, so you had code names for them. And you put an L in them because the Japanese couldn't pronounce L. He didn't know what Cordellas was, so he says, go over and there's a neighboring atoll over there and pick you out a likely target. Well, I wasn't on this flight, but Annie Anderson was, and 3 others, and Erickson was the best man at our wedding, and Andy saw this kind of raise of the ground, and then within these palm trees, and he let off a barrage, and it was an ammunition dump. And darn if the wonder the planes didn't all get, because the shrapnel came in and he came up and the explosion hit the planes, but they all got back. They didn't lose any one of the 3 planes. And that's the first time that rockets were ever used in military war. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how they got this picture of it, but I got it from the Navy. So I've talked an awful too much probably about it, but it was kind of...
Oh, not at all. And then you kept... You were on which aircraft carrier now?
I was on the Manila Bay, and one of the things that you do after the Liscum Bay blew up, they did a lot more about looking for submarines, and so they would send us out on 300-mile patrols during all the operations. And this day I had the patrol to go out, and I was loaded with 4 500-pound Torpex charges and a full load of rockets on a 300-mile search vector. And it's a long flight. I'd been in, and the thing, I got a plane and I'd never flown before. It was a TBM-3E. And a pilot doesn't always get their own plane because of the way they're staggered. And I was loaded, and they fired me off the catapult, because you couldn't fly with the loads, that you had to be catapult shots. And that plane, it went a 1/4 mile. I could just hold it off the water. But I did get my altitude. It just didn't fly the same as my regular old plane. Jodo, 2 of us shared it. My wife's name was Joan and his was Dorothy, so we called it Jodo. It was a good plane. That was the one I did the firing of the rockets with too, so I was really used to that plane. But I made the patrol, and then I got radio that they got a contact with a submarine, but I went over, all I saw was an oil slick. And I never did get to unload my load, and was ordered, because we were getting low on armament, they'll bring these things back aboard. And on my downwind leg, and we're really low on gas too, but I still had gas. But it was touch and go, that's for sure, and it was getting dark, because I'd been out 5.5 hours, and the plane just shuddered and flipped on its back and dove straight in and exploded. And they thought they'd taken a torpedo. It blew debris 1,000 feet in the air. How I got out, I don't know. There's nothing left of the plane or the crew or anything. And I was picked up by the Caldwell. I didn't know the Caldwell, USS Caldwell. And I'll never forget that. The captain, I remember, I'd always thought about going in, what would happen, and I saw so many guys go in and just go down with the plane. So my canopy was open. I was out of my chute, which you're always supposed to be under 500 feet. I reached on the lever of the release, but I didn't want to release because I was going straight in, but I didn't want to go down the plane. And I think what happened was that had to be this way, because they told me that the plane exploded as soon as it hit. And I think that simultaneously tripped that, and I was blown free, because there's a bar that comes across the top of the cockpit, if you'll notice in the video that was here the other day, and that hit my head here, and that's still no feeling in my head to this day through there, because I saw the explosion of the ships when the depth charges went off, and I was able to get, I didn't pass out. I got one side of my waist inflated, but there was nothing everything just completely disintegrated. But it was a little distance away when I saw this. I just had this recollection. So they always had a destroyer that was a rescue destroyer, because they had accidents a lot, and they'd come over. But they threw a life preserver out, and it landed right there, and I latched onto it. Let go, and then I heard them over the loudspeaker when they were first coming up, said, "Hey, there's a pilot out there. He's still alive." And so then they were coming at full speed when they threw this out to me, because they didn't expect to find anybody. And then they threw their props in full reverse, and that took me down under that deal. And how I missed the props, I don't know. It seemed like I was there forever. They pulled me back, and I was about out of it by that time, and a fellow came over and tied ropes around me and pulled me aboard, pulled me up, and I got aboard. But there was a doctor there, and I was a week now. I remember the captain's name was Abraham Lincoln. Kind of amazing, really.
The captain of the USS Caldwell?
Yeah, was Abraham Lincoln. And I was very bad shape, because the concussions and all had really broken all the capillaries in my body. My left leg was pretty well torn off, and I had shrapnel in my face, and I had shrapnel in my back, and I was there for a week, and then they transferred me to took me by launch to the SS Relief hospital ship. And I was on the Relief for a month, and then I went to, then I got to Pearl Harbor eventually, and was put in Base 8 there for, and they told me I could, there was an awful lot of pain during all this time. It was a hard time. But eventually a nurse wrote a letter to my wife, said that I was still living and was there, and they would send me home when I could walk. And so about, it took me about 4 or 5 months before I could take my first steps. And then I was put on finally I was bound I was going to walk, but I still had, this leg was in a cast. But when I got on, I got the pearl, and it was so hard for me. But I got on the ship, and I looked and I saw what I thought was my brother-in-law. They were just going back to San Francisco, and I told John, is that you? And it was, and that's when I came back with the 11 pilots that were left of the 87 that went out with that Marine Squadron, and we came back together. And then I was in the hospital in Long Beach, Naval Hospital, during that summer. And then when I could walk, and I still was having problems with my legs, but they still needed pilots, so that September I was sent out again, and that was really tough on both of us. And I didn't know where I was going. We went to San Francisco, and they put me on I didn't know anybody, on an old refrigerator ship that's going about 8 knots. And finally, after a week, they said I was going to the Admiralty Islands north of New Guinea. And I was to report to the Swanee as for duty, for flying duty. And so then my second tour was on, but I was having still trouble with my legs, and by the time I got to the Swanee, they were on the Pelileo engagement, and by that time there was no point in flying because all the Japanese were in the tunnels, in the holes, and our people were out, so you couldn't get to them. So the doctor said I could fly the planes all right. That wasn't a problem, but I was having trouble getting up and down the ladders, because I found out later, there's a poor medical deal. The leg, I don't know if you ever heard of Pellegrini disease or not, but when tremendous concussion comes on, then a calcification takes place over a period of time around that knee, and it's a very painful process. So the leg that looked so bad that had to be healed, that was okay. The other leg does give me problems. Well, they took me in an X-ray, and they says, "Wow, you got this Pellegrini disease," and because it was all calcified around that knee, no wonder you're having trouble getting up. And I want to know how I got in that plane, because I had time getting in this Avenger. How did I do that? Even when I was in good shape. But then they put me in the hospital at Lorengau in the Admiralty Islands, and that's when they found out when they took the X-rays and all. And then I was sent back, and then I was in the hospital trying to get this, because they were trying to get that leg. The leg still wasn't straightened out. I couldn't straighten it out, and they were working on that. And then in February, I was sent as a test pilot down at, actually where we done our night training. There was a cashew unit, and when planes would come in and they'd work them over, and that's when I got to fly all these different planes down there as a test pilot.
Down there?
In the desert.
Mm-hmm.
Not El Centro.
El Centro. Down in New Mexico.
It's right this side of Yuma, by the sand dunes down there. It's in the book.
Okay.
I got one of those senior moments for a second. I gotta forget that name.
That's okay.
But it was just a night. It was where the last place that the carrier pilots were sent to train for night landings, night work.
Okay. Robbie, Do you know what caused the explosion?
Well, I know what caused the crash. The crash was that it stalled with the heavy load with the 8 rockets. And you know, when you land on a carrier, you're flying 3 to 5 knots above stalling speed with full power. And I had full power on, but it was not enough to carry it with the load, and whether it was low enough on gas that it choked once. That's all it would take. But so I don't know, but I know that they found out later that your armament, the rockets wouldn't explode. But the charges, the Torpex charges, had an arming wire that went through the fuse, and when you activated them, you pulled those wires out automatically from the cockpit. You could charge those, and so that the wires, the arming wires were in there, but they found out later that in a violent crash like that, that the bombs pull loose from those arming wires, and so they automatically are ready to fire. Mm-hmm. And so they corrected that later in the war, because they did lose a number of pilots on water landings and things like that when the bombs went off, because they lost the bombs and the wires didn't stay with the bombs. They were hung up in the bomb bays.
Now, where were you when the war ended?
When the war ended, that was interesting. I was still an officer flying test work at the Hopeville Naval Air Station, and but I was due for just a routine physical over at the Naval Hospital in San Diego. So my wife and I were going to drive over, but everything was so crowded because they were getting ready, of course, for that time for the invasion of Japan. So there's a lot of activity, tremendous activity around the San Diego area. So we couldn't get a place to stay, so we stayed in a little motel in Alpine, about 30 miles east of San Diego. And then I could go in for my physical. And while we were staying there in this little motel in the afternoon, we started hearing sirens going off, and a lot of noise and horns honking, and my wife Joan said, "What's all of that?" And I just laughingly says, "Oh, I guess the war's over." But it actually was. And that was a big relief to a lot of people, because you'd think of the carnage that would have taken place if those landings had taken place. So it was a great day, great time of celebration. The war was over.
So you, in your view, dropping the 2 bombs in Japan was a good thing?
It bothers me that that in revision they've put so much emphasis on the fact that we dropped those bombs, but you don't realize that in Okinawa, in Okinawa alone, there were more people killed in the landings on Okinawa. They were killed with both of those bombs, and there were about 2 or 3 times as many people killed in Tokyo on the fire raids than there were killed by those 2 bombs. So think of what the carnage would have been if those landings would have taken place on the mainland. And you know, it's terrible when anybody kills. It's like that. It's a terrible thing, but that would have been small in comparison to what would have taken place if they hadn't been dropped. Mm-hmm. And just think of the forces that we had that poised in the Philippines and all that area right there, ready to go right at that time.
And then after the end of the war, how long were you in the service?
Well, I had a hard time getting out because I was still having some physical problems. So I was attached transferred to the hospital in Long Beach, California, at the Naval Hospital there. And it was interesting that my first child, a little girl, was born at the same time in the Naval Hospital there as when I was in the hospital at the same hospital. But I didn't have to stay in the hospital. I could come in and go, and they were working with a cast on my leg still. And so I enrolled in classes at the University of Southern California, USC. I always thought before the war I would stay in commercial aviation, but two things happened. One of I was hurt, and although I could have flown, I found out later, undoubtedly, I became pretty idealistic too, I think, and wanted to do something with my life. So although I graduated in economics, I decided that I would go back. I would not go back. I would want to go into public education, and so they needed teachers, and I took some courses at SC, and first semester took my practice teaching, but I needed money at this point now, a family and a little girl. So they had what was known as the War Emergency Credential, and you could do the same thing and get paid for it. So I took a War Emergency Credential and became a 5th grade teacher at the elementary school in Northridge out the San Fernando Valley. That was in the Los Angeles School District. And that was the hardest job I ever had, because I had to teach 5 subjects, and I thought there must be I had to build a home for myself, because you couldn't get builders in those times, you know. But I had to build a little home myself for our family in North Hollywood, and drove out to North, and then took night classes at the university. So it was a very busy time of my life, but I decided at the end of one semester that there'd be an easy way to earn a living. So a job opened up at Canoga Park High School to teach continuation education. That was with the Mexican young people. Some of them had dropped out of school, and nobody'd take the job. So I went out there and took that job for a semester, and I got a good start out there, because when they didn't attend school, I just go down to their parents and make friends with their parents and say, I need them in school, we can't, you know. And I guess it made an impression on the principal, because the second semester he asked if I would come in and teach history and government and take over the student government activities at Canoga Park High School. That was a big step in a hurry for me. So I did that, and then continued my work at the University of Southern California and got all my credentials, my secondary and my administrative credential, and then began working on my doctorate there. And those were hard years, because it was a long drive through that. There weren't freeways in those times, and I had to drive clear down to there, and we had a family, had 2 children, and so we had 3 children by that time. So they were hard years on my wife and mine, and living on a very little amount of money and trying to do all of this, but we made it. And you had to be a teacher for 5 years until you could take the administrative examinations, and then I took those and became a vice principal in Airport Junior High and in Venice, which is also part of the Los Angeles School District, and then asked to come out and start the first new high school that they'd had built from scratch in Los Angeles before the war, at Reseda High School, and went in there as vice principal, and then became principal of Reseda High, and then went over as principal of Airport High School, which is over by the Los Angeles International Airport, and was there a year. And by that time I'd finished my doctorate at USC and in educational administration and philosophy, and the dean called. Well, that's an amazing thing. He called my wife and I in one day, and he said, Robbie, he said, I know that no one's ever left an administrative job in the city of Los Angeles. There are 128 secondary schools there, and he said, if you keep your horizon open, why, he says, school will be behind you, so I had some ideas about education and what I wanted to do, and it seemed like the school system was getting so large in Los Angeles. When I was there, Reseda High School it started with 1,000. The 3 years when I left as principal, we'd grown 1,000 a year, 4,000 students. that school, and we were kind of ministering to school with directives from the downtown, and finally the dean called me back in. He said that they can't decide on who they want. They've had a nationwide search for a principal for Beverly Hills High School, which is right in the middle of Los Angeles, but it was a separate school district. And you just finished up your doctorate in the administration of education for the gifted. It was just after Sputnik had went off, and they had no programs launched for the education of the gifted and whatnot. And he said, you just might be getting a call from the superintendent, Kenneth L. Peters. And sure enough, on Easter Sunday morning, he said, would you consider coming over and talking about a job, because the board can't decide on who they want. And the dean said that we couldn't do any better if we just go right next door to the airport. It's kind of amazing, really. A pretty humbling experience. But I came over and talked about my philosophy of education and what I wanted to do, and then worked there, and it was I was on a year-to-year contract. That's all they could give me, and to leave that job to take a year-to-year contract when I had 10 years administrator, that's the reason people wouldn't leave, a place like Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. But I could build the program I wanted, and we built the finest program in the United States. And during that time, I served on the College Entrance Examination Board that developed the SATs, and piloted the first advanced placement program in America there. Served as chairman of accreditation teams for the Western Association of Schools and Colleges. And at the end of 17 years, my wife said, you're not ready to retire, and I got a call because they wanted me to come back to Texas, Family Foundation, the Howard Butt Family Foundations in Texas, to take a job there. So I took an early retirement and from schools and went back to Texas for 10 years and headed those foundations. It's like Albertson's company here, only it was a family-owned. It's the largest family-owned grocery chain in the world. Mm-hmm. The H-E-B Grocery Company comes, and I developed educational models for them for the continuing education of the laity, working with 13 seminaries throughout the Southwest to bring creative programs.
And what brought you to Boise, Idaho?
Well, actually, my wife came out and lived on spent a month with my boy who had graduated from the College of Idaho, and when he got his teaching credential, he was teaching in Lancaster, California, and lived on the old family ranch. And she went out and visited him, and she said, I think I could be happy living on that ranch. Well, I resigned my job the next day because I never thought she'd be happy living out on a ranch like that. So I left there in 1986 and developed the west end of that ranch and into really a beautiful place. And my boy, which is another story, he decided to go into the ministry. He'd been a teacher, and he taught for 17 years, and he was got the award as the outstanding teacher in that area. Now, the reason I tell you this story and why it's so important to me is because he was always a very good kid and a good athlete, and was youngest pilot in the city of Los Angeles on his 16th birthday, qualified. And I did that because he was having a very hard time in school, and he had a hard time reading, but we got him through. He get his pilot's license and whatnot, and he was an excellent pilot. And I thought, well, he could go into that. But he came up, the only place he could get into college was the College of Idaho at that time, on the basis of his coach. He was captain of the state championship cross-country team, and very, just a special kid, but had a very, very hard time with reading. He was dyslexic, and he had my daughters, or sisters. Two of his sisters were brilliant girls, and it was just a really tough situation. Well, he came up here, and because his coach and an English teacher said, "You'll never be sorry if you take this boy." And he came up here, and